Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard the Wright Flyer. Today's flight is piloted by Randy Wright, who is joined by his first officer Jeremy Grapenton. We know you have a choice when it comes to your radio listening pleasure, and would like to thank you for choosing to fly with the Wright Flyer. Ground traffic control has moved us to the departure lane, so please be seated, fasten your seatbelts, and ensure that all tray tables are stowed in the upright and locked position. We will be taking off shortly, and once again, we'd like to thank you for choosing to fly the Wright Flyer. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the show as we soar above the friendly airwaves in comfort and style.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard the Wright Flyer. This is your captain speaking, and I would like to take this opportunity to personally welcome you to our state-of-the-art radio program. We know you have a choice when it comes to your radio listening pleasure, and would like to thank you for choosing to fly the Wright Flyer. What's more, we are confident that no other radio program or venue will fly you over the friendly airwaves in as much comfort and style, nor leave you with an indelible yet pure sense of enlightenment quite like we can here at the Wright Flyer. Now that you're aboard, please be seated, fasten your seatbelts, kick back, relax, and enjoy the show. We've taxied to the departure lane and are awaiting takeoff clearance from air traffic control. While they go through that mindless, bureaucratic red tape and regimentation, my first officer, Jeremy Grapenton, and I shall delve into the pre-flight checklist because there is a lot of news and information to get to before we may indulge you with your in-flight entertainment. Well, folks, here's an interesting update. On Friday, September 18th, 2015, Donald J. Trump released his policy plan with respect to the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. Mr. Trump claims that the Second Amendment says that the right of the United States citizenry to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed whatsoever. This is interesting because it is completely contrary to the positions he used to hold with respect to the Second Amendment. I have to admit, this is the sort of language which I support. However, I am wary of political promises. The Second Amendment guarantee to protect the right to keep and bear arms is one of the sacred and fundamental principles of the United States governmental system. For a long time now, this fundamental right, guaranteed by the United States Constitution, has come under a serious and direct attack. Indeed, it has been the modus operandi of the left in this country to attack this right whenever they get the chance. And which is to say, rather, that the extreme left in America touts every tragedy as an opportunity to attack and besmirch the right to keep and bear arms. The Second Amendment is such an important guarantee to our fundamental liberties and rights that it takes one of the top spots in the Bill of Rights. It is important for us all to recall that this right is protected to ensure that the American people remain free from a tyrannical and despotic government. So far, the language used by Mr. Trump on his campaign website reiterates this important aspect of our Second Amendment right. Whether he is committed to it, as the site claims, or not, remains to be seen. Many politicians have made grandiose promises with regard to upholding and defending the Second Amendment, only to turn around and betray the electorate who placed them in the position of power. And I also have to delve into this. He wants there to be a universal standard for carry conceal licenses to be accepted between all 50 states. And I'm not so sure that I agree with that.
Well, let's take a look at this real quick. He says that the Second Amendment ensures that the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. How is it that, with understanding shall not be infringed, anybody would make the statement that all CPL licenses should be recognized as reciprocity throughout all 50 states? Shall not be infringed would mean that it would be Constitution carry, meaning you would not have to have a CPL or a CCW or CWL you wouldn't need that license or that permit. The only license or permit, so to speak, would be the Second Amendment.
Yes, and that's absolutely what the Founding Fathers had intended with that most sacred of rights, and that's why I'm a little wary of Donald J. Trump. He makes these great statements, but then he couches it with something which is totally contrary with the Constitution, and I think that that detracts from the message that he's trying to convey to the people and just shows that he lacks the full understanding of the Constitution. And again, as Jeremy and I have always said, you have to have a working, fluent knowledge of the Constitution to be really effective, especially when it comes to matters of government. It is the quintessential part of our government system that makes everything work. That is why Section 2 of Article 6 says that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Now, an update on Pope Francis's visit. Apparently, while he visited the island of Cuba, the pontiff avoided political dissidents who are outraged that he is lending credibility to the Castro regime. I can honestly say that I do not blame these political dissidents for being upset with the Holy Father. As someone from Latin America, Pope Francis should be in a perfect position to understand the plight and terrors wrought upon the Cuban people by this despotic Marxist regime. That said, we've already mentioned on previous shows that Pope Francis is committed to liberation theology. Liberation theology is the idea that salvation can be found through the tenets and doctrines of Marxism. They adhere to the revolutionary and radical creed, which prevents the Christian Gospels, or rather perverts the Christian Gospels, and adheres to the principles of Karl Marx. Is it any wonder, then, that the dissidents in Cuba are outraged with the Pope visiting Cuba? He has essentially told each and every one of them that their plight and all the horrors that they have been through are completely meaningless. What's more, the Castro brothers have prevented the dissidents from being admitted to the mass that he delivered in Havana. I'm guessing this would have been a day or two ago. Anyway, it's important to recall that the Pope established, or was the go-between in establishing diplomatic relations between the United States and the communist island of Cuba. And so again, it's as though he is belittling the plight that they went through. I find this story completely troubling. It reflects a further denigration of morality and common sense throughout the world. We should always be conscious of the dangers and evils of communism. According to My Way News, the dissidents are extremely upset that Pope Francis has chosen not to visit with their organizations during his visit to Cuba. Does the pontiff really think so little of human rights within the communist island? These are troubling questions which the Holy See has failed to answer.
I can foresee this creating another wave of refugee infusion into the United States yet again. It seems that every time there's an issue with Cuba, the citizenry there has tried to flee or made some attempt to get away, but they've been reined back in. With what happened earlier this year with this administration somewhat lifting sanctions and getting rid of the embargo, so on and so forth, this is just creating another storm that's brewing, and it's going to continue to brew. I don't understand why the Pope would be utilized as a diplomat in terms of as being a go-between between the United States and Cuba. It doesn't make sense to me. He's a dignitary for the Catholic Church, the Catholic religion. What does that have to do with the dealings of the United States and Cuba as far as political, what's the word I'm looking for? Political measures. Because Cuba's really been nothing more than a real small thorn in the side of the United States since Castro came to power. And with any Castro being in power down in Cuba, it's something that people need to pay attention to. With the storm brewing, things may seem calm now, but it's the calm before the storm that you really have to pay attention to.
Yeah, it really is. And I don't have the article in front of me, Jeremy, but there is already a report that there has been an increased wave of Cuban refugees coming to the United States. And, of course, this current political regime that we have running this country is completely ignoring it. And that is, of course, a great problem. In a related story to Pope Francis, who has wholeheartedly endorsed the hoax known as global warming or climate change, the Daily Caller published a piece on Thursday, September 17th, which states that so-called climate scientists are pressuring the Obama administration to prosecute climate change deniers. Folks, this is really troubling because it shows that the rabid and radical adherents to the climate change mythology are pushing to criminalize those who think differently than they themselves. In other words, the radical left in America today are attempting to criminalize certain thoughts and belief systems. Their radical agenda knows no limits, and they are determined to destroy anyone who disagrees with them, even in the most remote fashion. If climate change was really as much of a concern as these individuals claim, then why did their leading acolyte, Al Gore, use the money that he earned from selling his media interests to Al Jazeera News to purchase a house on the seashore? After all, I thought the number one concern of the climate change cult was that if we did not act to stop global warming, that the sea would rise, destroying the entire coast. The laws which the scientists are hoping to utilize in prosecuting so-called climate change deniers are the RICO laws. So, in other words, these climate scientists believe that anyone who does not march lockstep with their insane ideology are members of a criminal organization and conspiracy. This is absolute insanity, but that is the way of the radical and extreme left. Just as they can blame an inanimate object for murder, so too can they claim that those who disagree with them are mere criminals. Of course, this violates the United States Constitution in multiple fashions.
Well, if they're allowed to use the RICO statutes to go after individuals that don't march lockstep with climate change and global warming, so on and so forth, what's stopping them, should they be successful in doing that? What's stopping them from that point of going after Christians? Because they would be able, at that point, that would establish precedent, and they would be able to use that precedent to go after Christianity in terms of people who oppose radical Islam or Sharia law. There's a scenario developing now, and it's been developing for a long time, where people are of the mindset that things like Sharia law, much like global warming, can move in and be utilized as some kind of law that can trump the Constitution. Constitution is the supreme law of the land. We've stated that numerous times, and we'll state it as many times as need be. When people understand that, and they understand exactly how the Constitution works, the framework with it, they will be able to decipher between what's right and what's wrong. Sharia law has no authority to exist in the United States. It cannot be implemented as such. Just like with this global warming thing, they're wanting to make laws on it. We've seen the carbon tax laws in other countries. They've actually attached that to their ruling body and attached that to their charters, their constitutions, parliamentary procedures, so on and so forth, as being absolute law. Wrong. You can't have that with the Constitution, because anything that's contrary to it has no standing. It is unenforceable as law. That's what they're trying to do. Incrementalize the Constitution as being destroyed, picked apart, and done away with, so we have nothing but total chaos. There would be no set standard of law should that happen. It would be one person's rule against another person's rule, different ideologies conflicting with each other, total chaos, which would breed totalitarianism, because you would have a seat of power, the presidency of the United States or the federal government, which would say, okay, we'll go ahead and use this, but we won't use this type of law now, we'll use this law, and it'll be interchanging all the time. That is a recipe for disaster, and that is what destroys countries and pretty much eliminates them and wipes them right out of existence.
And Jeremy, it goes down the lines of how I've said that the radical left have always played this game of semantics. And I believe that has an extra stress and importance, because when you think about laws and the way that laws apply, definitions are exceedingly important. If you don't have a set standard of definitions accepted within a law, all of a sudden the law loses all of its meaning. And the United States has always been a nation of laws, not of men. That is the way that the founders interpreted it. And what that meant is that the law should apply to everyone equally, because everyone as a citizen is equal, because the sovereignty of the United States rests in the hands of the people. And that's why things such as this radical development with these climate change scientists is so dangerous, because it threatens to undermine the very foundation of this great republic of ours. Now, I'm going to tie this into another story here. According to Gallup, 75% of Americans believe that the government is suffering from widespread and rampant corruption. I suppose the part of me that finds this amazing, with respect to this poll, is the fact that so few Americans believe that the government is corrupt. I would have suspected that that number would be much higher. Nevertheless, this poll clearly demonstrates that the American citizens are frustrated with politics as usual. This may seem like a recurring theme on the Wright Flyer, but this is how the American people feel right now. And I really can't blame the American people for feeling in such a way. After all, whenever the government is embroiled in a scandal, nothing ever seems to be done. For instance, we've discussed the litany of investigations that went nowhere with scandals such as Benghazi, Fast and Furious, the NSA snooping program, and countless others. Who can also forget the scandal that surrounded the VA hospital system? At the time, a flurry of outrage was expressed by the American people, yet as with everything with this current administration, nothing substantive was done to correct the problem. I believe that this is the reason why the American people hold the government in such contempt. Rampant corruption is a real problem, and it's one that just isn't going away. And it's not just a figment of the popular imagination. Rather, it is the stark reality and a new normal with respect to governmental operations in America today. In other words, one would not be incorrect in saying that the government is completely corrupt and no longer represents the interests of the American people. Everywhere one turns, someone or something is out of place or something isn't working right. Of course, corruption is not a new thing with respect to the federal government. However, in the case of this current administration, the corruption seems more widespread than it has been in living memory. I'm reminded of another presidential administration that was marred by political scandal and corruption. President Ulysses S. Grant's administration was also known for widespread and rampant corruption. In fact, it was under his tenure that the term lobbyist was coined. They earned this rather dubious title because it was said that all of the special interest groups would hold a meeting with the president at the lobby in Willard's Hotel, and that it was within this lobby that the backroom deals were completed.
Well, we could look at other, scandals as well. One that we haven't mentioned yet, voter fraud. Back in, the 2008 election? Oh, let's go back to the 2000 election. With Al Gore. The votes being recounted. People talked about voter fraud this, voter fraud that. And then we saw it again. We've been seeing it ever since then. What happens when an issue like that comes up? Somebody on either, doesn't matter, on either side of the aisle, brings up voter fraud. What they're ultimately doing is going after the voters. They're disenfranchising the voters. They're nullifying their votes, which when you nullify someone's vote after they've exercised their right, you're basically disparaging their right, which is a violation of the Constitution. There's 5 amendments in the Constitution that specifically deal with the right to vote. So it would be 5 individual violations of that person's right. And under federal law, each one of those violations of their right would carry an individual charge. Are the courts going to look at it that way? No, they're not. They'll lump it together as one incident and put the charge all the way across the board under one charge. That's typically how the courts will look at it. But when you have instances that create the voter fraud, like redistricting, out in California this happened. I can't remember the county. I want to say it was Ventura County, California. Our mutual friend Nelson, as you recall, Randy, you know the story behind that, with the dealings where his significant other was teaching, and the local Democratic redistricting community was involved in a scandal of allowing school kids, grade schoolers, to complete the census on behalf of their parents. Now, when that happens, that's a felony in and of itself. And that whole situation, it didn't turn out very well for the individuals involved. So when things like that happen, they don't make the mainstream media. They're kind of pushed aside. They're only mentioned briefly in passing. That keeps the voting populace ignorant as to what's really going on. You only hear about things with voter fraud pertaining to, again, the 2000 election, where Al Gore filed lawsuit, Democrat Party filed lawsuit saying they wanted to recount down in Florida, so on and so forth. Big things like that happen, but it's the little things that are allowed to go unchecked, and those are the things that are chipping away at the sanctity of what the Constitution holds as far as people's rights. It's a blatant attack, but yet it's a stealthy one on the sovereignty of the citizens of the United States. And these things need to be brought to light. They cannot go unchecked. They cannot be allowed to continue to chip away at the sanctity of the Constitution, furthermore, the sovereignty of the American citizen.
And that's exactly why the American people are feeling that the government is corrupt. And it is part of the reason why we here at the Wright Flyer are so dedicated to ensuring that this information is heard, because it is a real problem. The attack on sovereignty has accelerated at an exponential rate, and it shows no signs of slowing down, especially when it comes to the detente wing of the Republican Party. And this ties into the next story. The Washington Times put out a piece on September 18th in which they asked a rather poignant question, namely whether Democrats and Republicans were speaking about the same country. Jeremy, both you and I have discussed on multiple occasions how the Democrats have a different outlook for the proper scope and application of the federal government than the true conservatives in America. However, I think this article misses one of the major factual points that has frustrated the base of the GOP for quite a long time. That is, the detente wing of the GOP, or as it is commonly known, the establishment wing of the Republican Party, does not differ much in its view for the country than Democrats do. The fact of the matter is that the establishment of both the Democrat and Republican parties hold almost exactly the same vision for the country. Indeed, the only difference of which I can think is the rate at which the country should adopt this embracing of a radically centralized and overbearing federal government. That is the only thing that they really disagree on. In fact, both parties share a disdain for the United States Constitution. Still, the mainstream media does not want to parse out this issue. They continue to operate under their unyielding agenda of pushing for a larger, more intrusive and bloated federal government. None of the political pundits seem to want to pull back the size and scope of the federal government. Rather, they argue for pushing forward full steam ahead, and they don't seem to give a hoot about what the American people desire. If you think about it, this overregulation on the part of the federal government is slowly strangling the lifeblood out of small businesses all throughout this country. What has happened to the American dream? I'll tell you. It's been hijacked by those nefarious elements who wish to fundamentally transform the United States of America.
You know, I've used this analogy to describe this very situation. And I've created this scenario. Let's say that there was a bottomless pit that was just, let's say it was created here on Earth as a bottomless pit. The American people are being walked to the edge of it and ultimately jumped and thrust over like a bunch of lemmings. Now, when I say we're being walked that way, think of, and I want our listeners to think about this. Let's say there was one individual that represented the United States as a whole. Okay? You have, as a complete individual, 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, everything, set the way a normal individual would be. Now picture this. Your arms are behind your back and they're bound. You can't move them. There's no way that you could possibly free the arms. You have both legs moving in lockstep with each other to a rhythm that's back and forth, just purposely continuing on this path leading straight ahead to the edge of this cliff that ultimately, when you go over, you will never land. It's the bottomless pit. And you're blinded to where you have no idea which way you're going. You don't know when it's going to happen, if it's going to happen. But when you do realize it's happening, it's too late and you can't stop it. Those 2 legs represent the left leg, of course, the Democratic Party. The right leg, the establishment of the GOP. Now, the 2 arms that are bound behind the back would be, the left arm would be the more conservative blue dog Democrat Party, those that actually adhere to the Constitution and respect it, and then the right arm being those who also adhere to the Constitution, respect it, and want it to be fully enforced. Neither one of those hands are able to be freed to remove the blindfold. They're being stifled because the legs are moving too fast. And it puts us into a situation where we have no idea currently how to end this. If there was some way to remove the blindfold so that that individual who represents the embodiment of the American people can see what's going on, see the dangers ahead, being able to see would also be able to create the instance to where we can think, we can start assessing things, analyzing, coming up with a way to free our hands from stopping what's going on. Ultimately, the only way to stop this would be to cut off the legs of that individual, because it is the legs that is marching us to our imminent death as a country. It needs to stop. We need to get control of this. Otherwise, we're going to be plunged over the edge. And once that happens, there's no coming back from that. It's a very dark and eerie and very scary mindset. And again, I can't emphasize enough, and I know Randy is on board with me with this, as well as many other individuals we know, and hopefully you, our listeners, will surely understand this too. We have to get control of this. We, the people, have to get control of this. We need to figure out a way to stop this. I don't want anybody who is elected to continue us down this path. The longer it happens, the more detrimental it's going to be, and the less chance and time we will have to stop it from occurring and taking place.
And it is because the entire notion, as you basically pointed to with a perfect analogy there, is to tear out this notion of self-accountability, self-respect, self-responsibility from the American people. They want to make us more docile because in that case it's easier to strip away the knowledge that we have concerning the proper scope and application of our government, to replace our citizenry with, well, let's take the illegal alien issue so that they can be more easily molded to fit this corrupt ideology that the government has to redefine us. It's why I get so upset when people say that the United States is a democracy. We never have been a democracy. And when you claim it's a democracy, it makes it that much easier to tear apart the United States Constitution and to replace the fundamental and supreme law of the land, which of course is all by design. And speaking of the ones that are wanting to take away our fundamental rights and to completely redefine who we are in America, things aren't going well for Debbie Wasserman Schultz. A large crowd of Democrat voters turned against her during a rally, demanding that the DNC schedule and hold more debates. As you all know, the Republicans have already held 2 presidential candidate debates. Meanwhile, there appears to be no debate, at least in the immediate future, scheduled for the Democrat candidates. Debbie Wasserman Schultz is the current DNC chair, which is to say she is in full control of the Democrat debate schedule. In fact, the DNC has already rescheduled the debates more than a handful of times. Speculation has run amok that Mrs. Schultz has foregone the candidate debates in order to protect the presumptive Democrat frontrunner, Hillary Clinton, as she suffers from a slew of scandals surrounding her use of a private email server during her tenure as Secretary of State. Mrs. Clinton has already slipped behind Bernie Sanders in the polls of several key primary states. However, there is some sign now that she is starting to once again take the lead in some, and I believe that's cooking the book and voter fraud and intimidation. But anyway, the main problem that she's facing is that 100,000 pages of emails have been turned over to the State Department. All of this has had a detrimental impact on Mrs. Clinton's trustworthiness and likability with the American voter. Hillary has attempted to respond to this by doubling down on her partisan rhetoric. According to the Associated Press, Mrs. Clinton claimed that the Republican candidates are merely harping on the problems in the country rather than proposing real, concrete solutions. But what solutions, if any, have Democrats offered the American people? All of the problems which are facing the United States of America today have a single and simple solution. We, here at the Wright Flyer, have repeated this numerous times. If the United States of America is to ever get back on track, it must, once again, embrace the tenets, scope, and application of the United States Constitution. Of course, this is never a solution that will be proffered by the Democrat Party. After all, they are diametrically opposed to the limited scope of government imposed by the United States Constitution.
Well, with the Democrat Party, all one has to do is look at through history, and they could see the framework and the design of them wanting to destroy this country, this republic. The idea of having control, the only way you can fully have control is if you get the will of the people on your side. You get them to understand and adhere to your concepts. The Democrats did this masterfully with precision back in the 50s with the civil rights legislation. It was the Republicans that put forth the civil rights legislation in the mid-50s, and it was the Democrats that stonewalled it. They filibustered it. They voted against it for 7 years. Lyndon Baines Johnson was one of the key players in that. For 7 years, he was very outspoken about it, very adamant about it. And all of a sudden, in 1963, when he took over as president after Kennedy's assassination, then they started to rework it. They revisited the legislation. It was passed, and then with a stroke of a pen, he made it law. And after he did that, and this is a direct quote from him, not once but twice, he made this quote, and there was governors from other states that were present when he did this and made this very statement, this statement that speaks volumes to the Democrats' party abhorrent design and perpetuity of racism, which they cry folly now. They're always talking about racist this, racist that. LBJ was quoted as saying, and again, these are his quotes, "I'll have those niggers voting Democrat for the next 200 years. Now, I find that word to be disgusting, as should everybody find it to be disgusting. But the point is, he said it. He said it with verbally, he said it with the stroke of a pen, because he looked like the champion white knight in shining armor when he signed that legislation into law. It was all done by design. He was against it, and this is the issue of, again, we've heard this before, I was against it before I was for it, or I was for it before I was against it, vice versa, whatever, which way you want to apply it. The fact of the matter is, him as well as a slew of other Democrats were in complete opposition to civil rights legislation. And then they signed it into law, and then they used that to say, look what we did for you. We did this. It's a measure of keeping their thumb on individuals. Now, if I was an African American and I understood this and looked at all this, and these are all facts, I would be extremely annoyed, angered and beyond upset with this. There would be no way that I would ever be able to vote for a Democrat because of what they represent. They don't represent the people. They never have. They don't represent the individual. They don't represent their rights. They don't represent anything that makes us a sovereign individual. They represent what is in their best interest, and they use the people to achieve that. That is all done by design. That is what they've always done, and they will continue to do so. And having an understanding of that, it befuddles me and confuses me as to why, when individuals even find out about this, they know it's factual, they've seen it, but they make the statement that perpetuates their own willful ignorance. And the statement is, my family's always voted Democrat, and it's a family tradition. I'm going to continue to do it. That would be like someone walking up to a hot stove, putting their hand on it, knowing that it's going to burn them, but because it's a family tradition, and it's because they believe that that's what's supposed to be done, they repeatedly put their hand on that hot burner. They know what the consequences are going to be, but they are so willfully ignorant and so willfully acceptable of the consequences for their own demise, and it's just a continuance of self-destruction. It's beyond me. I can't fathom why anybody would ever want to actually, behave in that manner. It's, like I said, I'm completely at a loss for words as to how someone could actually operate that way. They want freedom, they want to be an individual, they want this, they want that, they don't want their rights violated, but yet they continue to perpetuate things that they go against everything that they want. I can't explain it any other way than that.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what it is. And it's always the same thing with the Democrats, Jeremy. They try and divide and conquer the American people. They have no unified vision for the United States per se. In fact, the only unified vision they have is expanding the scope of government until there is but one centralized government at a global level. It's funny. If you think back to several months ago, Debbie Wasserman Schultz struggled to differentiate a Democrat and a socialist. There was a point in time in American history where there was a clear and distinct difference between the two. You mentioned them with the Blue Dog Democrats. However, the radical, hardcore left in America has basically bowed to the authority of the Democrat Party and this notion of pushing for a centralized government. They have usurped the Democrat Party, just as they are usurping the Republican Party through this detente and establishment wing of the GOP. And so as a consequence, the Democrat Party has gone far left. It is for this reason that we can decisively conclude that the Democrat Party is completely out of touch with the average, decent, hardworking American citizen, despite the fact that their policies have failed at every level. As you've mentioned, the Democrats continue to double down on their hardline socialist antics. But, as the former British Prime Minister, the late Margaret Thatcher, once said, the problem with socialism is that at some point you run out of everyone else's money. And based on the tepid economy here in the United States, it is safe to say that we are fast running out of other people's money. I do have to admit, I'm rather alarmed that someone who is an avowed socialist, Bernie Sanders, has gathered such widespread popularity in America today. This would have been unfathomable even 15 years ago. Nevertheless, the climate in this country is such that an avowed socialist is not only able to challenge the presumptive frontrunner of the Democrat Party, but also mount a somewhat successful campaign. political pundits continue to focus on the fact that as an independent seeking the Democrat nomination for the office of president, Bernie Sanders is a bit of an outsider. However, the fact that he has held political office seems to refute that notion in entirety. You know, the truth is, and the real point here is, the fact that the Democrats have gone so far to the left that a radical like Bernie Sanders appears to be the only sort of viable candidate that they can produce for their base. And that is all their base will accept. And that is a striking statement as to the condition of the Democrat Party in America today.
Well, again, this would be history repeating itself. Let's go back and take a look at Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler was an admitted socialist. Adolf Hitler was put up by the Fabian Society, the Fabian Socialists that operated within Germany with under the Reich and so on and so forth. Adolf Hitler appeared to be more moderate than they did, just as Bernie Sanders appears to be moderate in comparison to the other run-of-the-mill Democrats. When he was put in place as chancellor, all of that changed. It was like a complete about-face, and then incrementally, again, this is the incrementalization. Socialism always operates on small measures, taking away little snips and chunks out of something that is pure and designed to be in perpetuance of liberty, freedom, sovereignty, chipping away at it. Hitler did that with his whole reign of terror during his whole time in office. He went after individuals, Jews, gypsies, Polish individuals, people that did not agree with what he wanted the fatherland to exemplify. Anybody that opposed him or the leanings of the Nazi Party were done away with. They were rooted out, they were hunted, they were dispatched, killed. Many people fled in fear of their own lives because they understood the tenets of what was happening to them. We're seeing the same thing with the Democratic Party. They have become so entangled with Fabianism that, again, Bernie Sanders being elected as a senator, and he is appearing as being a moderate. This is a stealth move on their part. As for other Democratic candidates, who do they have? They've got Hillary with everything that she's got, caving down around her. Bernie Sanders. What other hopefuls do they have? I can't think of any. Elizabeth Pocahontas Warren? Really? Castro out of Illinois? Really? Like we need a Castro to be in charge of the United States. They have all these individuals that names have been dropped, but I don't see any movement with them. It's almost like they're spinning around, running in circles and not being able to accomplish anything. But at that point in time, something's going to happen to where it's going to catch, and then they're going to take off in a screaming fashion and run that straight line. And people are going to jump on board thinking it's going to be the thing that's going to save them. This is the mindset of the American people that we need to change. People want to talk about change this, change that, hope and change, so on and so forth. I don't have a problem with hope. Hope is what this country, one of the fundamental things this country was built on. A hope for people to be able to live free as sovereign individuals. It was a hope of the Founding Fathers that we are the last beacon of liberty and freedom. It was their hope that people would come here so that they can live out the proverbial American dream of being a sovereign citizen with freedoms that are not taken from them. That aspect of hope is one that we should not forget, and people should refuse to ignore. The change aspect of it, people have to change their mindset. It's already been changed once to ignore freedom, liberty, the Constitution. It's been subverted and taken away from them. The mindset has to be changed back to having an understanding of the Constitution. Because with that mindset, then the hope can live again as far as people being free and sovereign and individuals. What is the Democratic Party going to do with this? They're going to take this and they're going to streamline it, and it's going to be like a freight train taking a dirt road out of control, but people are going to be so blinded because their mindset is not right that they're going to be perceived as tunnel vision. They're going to think it's heading on a straight and narrow path, and they're going to be so willing to jump on board because they think this is what's going to save them. Part of the mindset that needs to be changed is people need to realize there's no elected official on either side, no matter how conservative or liberal, leftist leaning that anybody could be perceived as being. They are not going to save you. There's only two things in this world that people can grasp the concept of being saved. That is having Jesus Christ as their Savior, and with that, having the responsibility and the acceptance of being able to do for themselves. Accepting their own responsibility for their own actions, doing things in accordance of the law, understanding what their freedoms and liberties are. That is your salvation when it comes to political terms. Having an understanding and then knowing how to gauge individuals who are candidates or who want to represent you, holding them in check. They're not going to save you. You have to understand you can save, and only you can save yourself. Because you have to have the mindset in order to do it. You have to have that understanding. What is at stake? Your rights, freedoms, liberties are being taken from you. It's self-preservation. The Constitution allows this. In fact, it guarantees that you have the right to preserve yourself. Your liberties. You have the right to defend them for self-preservation. For the perpetuity of this nation to continue on, for our posterity, our lineage down the line, generations. That is the only way that this country can be saved. We have to have the mindset of people accepting responsibility and understanding what their rights and liberties are. Don't put all of that on the shoulders of candidates. No matter how much you agree with them, understand this. They represent you in your best interest. At least they are supposed to. If they fail to do that, are they saving you? Are they fixing things for you? Are they making this world or this country a better place for you that works within the scope of your freedoms and liberties? If they fail to do that, then all is lost. At that point, you have to make a change. You have to understand what's going on. You have to hold them accountable, because holding them accountable is accepting responsibility for your actions. If you vote them into office and they don't do what you expected them to do or adhere to the Constitution for the beneficent of this country, then they need to be removed and somebody else put in place.
And that's exactly what it comes down to with respect to the people being the sovereigns of the country. It is always a notion that needs to be understood throughout this country that with rights comes responsibility. And with sovereignty, especially sovereignty over a great republic like the United States, comes the greatest amount of responsibility. It is why the Founding Fathers envisioned this country being based at its very core, at the very heart of the nation, on the notions of self-respect and self-accountability and self-responsibility. If you do not embrace those things, if you delegate those things to your representatives in entirety, you are allowing tyranny to reign supreme. It's as Thomas Jefferson had said, that when the government, and I'm paraphrasing here, but when the government no longer fears the citizens, and the citizens come to fear the government, that is where tyranny reigns. And we are absolutely seeing that here in the United States today. Our government no longer fears we, the people. It sees we, the people, as pawns to be used in this political game that they're trying to do in order to send their feelers, their tentacles, their pointers out to destroy and ensnare the American people, dragging them down to this bottomless pit of an abyss that you had mentioned in the previous segment, and they have shown no signs in slowing down with respect to that. And we can't operate under the notion that politicians can save us, because that responsibility rests squarely with us. And when we delegate that, it's like saying that you can delegate an unalienable right. No, you don't have the authority, even as an individual, to delegate your unalienable rights, because under the natural law theory, only the Creator has the authority and the wherewithal to do that. Now, I'm going to follow up here with a story regarding that Phoenix, Arizona case we mentioned on our first show. It was said that a suspect has been captured. A landscaper who is suspected in the alleged freeway shootings told a judge on Saturday that authorities have the wrong guy. He sought to strengthen this contention by claiming that he hasn't owned a firearm in at least 2 months. The suspect, Leslie Allen Merritt Jr., has been charged with several counts which include aggravated assault, criminal damage, disorderly conduct, as well as carrying out a drive-by shooting with intentional acts of terrorism. While we both have mentioned that with the right to keep and bear arms comes the responsibility to ensure that we don't encroach upon the rights of others, I'm a little befuddled by lumping in the intentional acts of terrorism charge here. I think that the use of the phrase terrorism in this context establishes a rather dangerous precedent. It is not a wild leap of imagination to see the government stretching the definition of the word terrorism to include mere ownership of a firearm. After all, that is in line with the sort of thinking that former Attorney General Eric Holder espoused. It's important to recall that Mr. Holder claimed that it was his desire to have gun owners, as well as defenders of the Second Amendment, perceived in the same negative light as cigarette smokers. It's that sort of devious thought process that is the most dangerous thing facing the American public right now. Another problem that I have with the handling of the Phoenix freeway shooting case is what Governor Doug Ducey proclaimed on Twitter. Merritt was arrested by a SWAT team who swarmed him at a Walmart in the suburb of Glendale, Arizona on Friday evening. Shortly thereafter, Governor Ducey raced to Twitter proclaiming that, "We got him." I'm sorry, but what the hell happened to the presumption of innocence until proven guilty? This is a sort of reckless handling of criminal matters by politicians which makes my blood boil. If this man is truly guilty, then the entire jury pool has been potentially tainted by a politician seeking to score political points. If the jury pool has been tainted, then it encroaches upon the Fifth and Sixth Amendment rights of the accused. We must all remember that those rights are safeguarded by the Constitution for a very important reason. Without those safeguards, any one of us could be wrongfully targeted by the authorities for crimes which we did not commit. After all, the burden of proof falls upon the government to establish that the accused committed the crime beyond a reasonable doubt. That is the highest standard of proof in any form of court case. It is the highest evidentiary standard. Civil cases, on the other hand, are only required to meet a standard of proof by a preponderance of the evidence. In other words, that it is more likely than not, 51%, that the events complained of occurred. with respect to a criminal case, beyond a reasonable doubt means that it must be near absolute proof that the accused actually committed the crimes for which he or she is charged.
Now, it's my understanding that this particular incident, that no firearms have actually been utilized or even used in the incident. I've heard reports of that it was nothing more than a wrist rocket or a slingshot with steel slingshot ammunition, small ball bearings, so to speak. So, if that's the case, then how is there any firearms charges actually being attached to this? We would have to look at what the state of Arizona classifies as a firearm, because the federal government, their laws, or perceived laws, because really the statutes on firearms and whatnot are actually handed out and doled out by the ATF, which has no authority to make any law or regulation whatsoever. They don't classify slingshots as being a firearm. So, how would the state classify a slingshot? To my knowledge, I could be wrong, I'll have to check into this, but I don't believe that the state of Arizona does classify slingshots as a operable firearm. So, these charges, if that's indeed the case, aren't even warranted. They're malicious charges. Granted, if this individual is guilty, which we should not assume he is, because we would be guilty of denying him equal protection under the laws as far as presumed innocence goes. We have to wait and see all the facts. There has to be due process. There has to be a conviction. There has to be substantial proof and evidence that this actually did occur by this individual. These things, when they happen in this fashion, this harkens back to tyranny gaining a foothold in this country. Again, the incrementalization. One small incident like this, and I use the word small because it's a very segregated and isolated incident, but when you have hundreds or thousands of them pop up all over the country, things like this happening, each incident is another incremental chip away that takes away from the sovereignty of the Constitution and what it entails. And I'm reminded also of a quote from Thomas Jefferson. He said that the only thing tyranny needs to gain a foothold is for people of good conscience to do nothing. What he means by that is people of a good conscience in that aspect would be understanding what your rights are, what the Constitution entails, how it implies. It would be placed squarely on the shoulders in this point of the legal system, understanding how the Constitution is to work, and them being bound by it and following it to the letter and in accordance with the spirit of the Constitution. When they fail to do that, they are not of good conscience. Therefore, they are allowing tyranny, again, to gain a foothold. The door's been opened and they're walking in. Tyranny is walking in and establishing itself ever so slightly over time. I want to look more into this case. I want to see all the facts on this. I want to see exactly what the charges are, how they're levied in accordance to the Arizona state law, federal government law, because when they operate and make the charge of acts of terrorism, that's a federal issue. So where's all this going to go? We need to get all the facts and so on and so forth with regard to this so that everybody has a better understanding to where people can exercise a good conscience in getting this resolved.
And, you know, the Associated Press went on to report that authorities are worried that there might be copycat offenders out there. Apparently, 11 cars in total were hit with projectiles of some sort, such as BBs or pellets, as you mentioned, as they drove along Phoenix freeways from August 29th and September 10th at sporadic points. Fortunately, there have been no serious injuries, but a 13-year-old girl's ear was cut by a shard of glass when a projectile shattered a car window. So what this report from the AP demonstrates is that we aren't even sure what sort of projectiles were fired at the cars in question. So this, once again, strengthens what you were saying about we not even being sure that we could charge this as a firearm issue, because it could be a slingshot or it could be an air gun. We don't know at this time. So what this report from the AP demonstrates is that we just aren't sure what has happened yet. Therefore, the governor to go out and to leap onto Twitter and make this claim that they got him seems premature at best. It's just, when you play recklessly with the United States Constitution, with respect to the Sixth Amendment, which states that you should be able to face your accuser, and that you have the right to a swift and speedy trial that's fair in front of a jury of your peers, with, say, like the Fifth Amendment, it's all tied into this fact that the government carries the burden of proof to demonstrate that the accused actually committed these crimes. Otherwise, we are facing the real dilemma of government overreaching its authority in nearly every aspect. And as an attorney, that troubles me, because we take an oath of office to uphold and defend the United States Constitution. And when the jury pool is tainted by a governor attempting to score political points, it makes our job nearly impossible. It places us in that untenable situation where we have to choose between whether we would continue with this, and, you know, that would make it be to where we potentially violate our oath of office, or we don't proceed with the prosecution, whether we think we have a strong case or not. Because the whole notion of our rights and being able to defend those rights in a systematic and concrete fashion is part of the bedrock of our Republican system of government. And the judiciary should not be tampered with or played with like that, especially when it comes to fundamental, unalienable rights of citizens, even when they are accused of heinous crimes. But as the Associated Press had already stated with this, no serious injuries have occurred. But to seek terrorism charges, that goes back to this whole notion of semantics. The powers that be playing semantics, changing important definitions of words to make them into terms of art where the goalposts are constantly moving, that is detrimental to the country at large.
This actually points to something we've talked about before regarding the media. And again, this is the incrementalization of things coming to pass to where there's a precedent so much established. Not so much a legal precedent, but a precedent that's been burned on the minds, in the eyes and ears of the American voter. When you have a media outlet extrapolating the circumstances beyond the scope of what really happened, you're creating an essence of fear. You're creating an essence of, this needs to stop. It's a false representation of the facts. Time and time again, we've seen this happen. We saw it happen with George Zimmerman when the media put out there that he was a white Hispanic. You saw it with Michael Brown. The first thing that the media puts out, unarmed black teen murdered or shot and killed by a white police officer. They use these semantics, these buzzwords, catches and phrases to invoke fear, to set an agenda, to establish something that can be used, again, ultimately, with the media, again, like you mentioned, tainting the jury, tainting the evidence, creating the false positive that this is what happens, and again, the mindset of the individuals has to be changed. When the media puts something out like this, the average American person who works one job full-time, 2 jobs, both parents in the household, or even if it's a single parent, they don't much have time to sit down and analyze what's really going on. They catch their news on the fly. Now, I'm not making excuses for them, and in no way, shape, or form, and I want to point this out there, that the individual that committed this crime in Arizona, are we defending him in any way, shape, or form? We're not defending the accused so much as saying the charges are not valid to the extent of placing him on him. No, we're defending the sole premise of the constitutional rights that are entailed with this. A lot of people seem to forget or aren't even aware of that when an individual is accused of a crime, they have rights. No matter how heinous that crime is, they still have rights under the Constitution, if they're an American citizen, that need to be preserved. That is the sole responsibility and sole job of any defense lawyer. That's their first priority, to make sure that their defendants' rights are not violated. It's also the prosecutor's job to make sure that the defendant's rights are not violated by bringing malicious and unwarranted and false charges, because in doing so, you're violating their rights right there on the spot. So there has to be this understanding of how the rights are entailed. This is why we are so adamant about people understanding the Constitution. I've recommended that people go and get a copy of the Constitution. Read it. If you don't understand some of the verbiage, I've told them, get in touch with me. I will explain it to the best of my ability, and if I can't explain it, I know someone who can, and I will point you in their direction. I also advocate for people to get copies of the Federalist and Anti-Federalist Papers. In my opinion, those 2 documents, the Federalist Papers and Anti-Federalist Papers, serve as not only a guide, but an encyclopedia of sorts that exemplifies and defines the intentions of the Constitution, the writings that the framers put into the Constitution. They give a better understanding of what exactly they meant with regards to, let's say, the Second Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, and Sixth Amendment in this case. Having that understanding, that knowledge, and I understand some of these things are a very dry read for individuals. Sometimes you have to endure a dry reading or something that may seem boring to alleviate yourself of having that mindset. Keep this in mind and stay focused on, you need to understand this. This is the means of having the understanding. And one other thing that individuals should have with them when reading the Constitution, the Federalist Papers and Anti-Federalist Papers, get yourselves a valid dictionary. Oxford Dictionary is a great dictionary to have. Look up the terms that you may not understand. Certain words that may confuse you. It is imperative that an understanding is reached on this. This is the only way that we can absolve this notion of people being wrongfully accused, or the media putting out things in order to be divisive in nature, to have something slanted in one direction for their own agenda. And for elected officials, it holds them in check of not being able to score, as Randy said, political points. it is our responsibility as American citizens to understand these things, again, because this is what leads us to being able to continue on as a great nation, a great republic that is consistent with being sovereign. Not only a sovereign nation, but sovereign individuals. We the people. The first three words of the United States Constitution. We the people. We are the ones who created this country. Essentially. We are the ones who delegate the authorities. We are the ones that allow them to represent us. We give our consent to those who would govern over us. Since we delegate that authority to them, it is our duty and obligation to hold them in check, and when such time comes, it is our responsibility and duty to remove that delegation of authority and place it with somebody else who is more fit for the job.
Right, because when it comes to your defense, you have to remember that lack of knowledge is not a defense to criminal charges. However, being possessive of a working and fluent knowledge of the United States Constitution can help ensure that you get the best protection that you can. And that is why the United States Constitution is so important. It recognizes and it states for all of the world to see that you, as the basis of sovereignty in the United States, as an American citizen, are endowed with these unalienable rights which cannot be taken away from you. And it is part of your sacred honor, your character, your ability to contribute to society as a whole here in the United States to have a working knowledge of how your system works. Because then not only can you participate in it, you are able to more deftly act for yourself. And that means also assisting in your defense if you ever find yourself in a position where you are charged. And even if it is a correct charge, it still should be that the government is held to the constitutional standards, because if they do not adhere to the tenets of the United States Constitution when it comes to prosecuting offenses, then they are acting in an unlawful manner, as Jeremy and I have stated here multiple times. And that is why we continue to harp upon this issue as we do, because we are adamant about ensuring that your rights are not encroached upon. Because just as your rights are being encroached upon, so too are ours. And it is an undeniable truth that the powers that be, especially when you have sloppy cases like this, are encroaching upon our rights. And that is blatantly violative of the United States Constitution. Turning back to the Pope's visit for a moment, Republican Congressman Paul Gosar has announced that he will boycott the Pope's address to a joint session of Congress. Congressman Gosar stated that he has both a moral obligation and a leadership responsibility to do so. I think this is an interesting development, and one that might grow. After all, Pope Francis has aggressively assaulted the American capitalist system on numerous occasions. It is always a dangerous thing when religious leaders attempt to wade into political issues. What makes Representative Gosar's decision all the more meaningful is the fact that he is a practicing Catholic. What's more, the pontiff's willingness to embrace the unproven hoax of global warming has not won him any favor with conservative American Catholics. After all, I don't think that it is proper for the leader of the Holy See to wade into such issues. His primary concern, indeed his only concern, should be that of salvation, and that is shared by every Christian. Salvation of the soul. Global warming really has no impact upon that undeniable creed and mission of the Christian faith. Therefore, by engaging in these issues, the Pope is lending a false sense of credibility to the whole global warming farce. I believe this runs along the lines of the true notion of separation of church and state. Of course, that phrase is often misconstrued here in America. James Madison truly explained the real purpose behind the notion of a doctrine of separation of church and state. It does not mean that there cannot be any display of faith within governmental institutions or on government buildings. On the contrary, such displays are acceptable because they have a long and well-established history in America. What's more, the very notion of natural law upon which the United States Constitution is based is rooted in a Judeo-Christian philosophy. Madison was seeking to avoid the entanglement of religion with government, that is, giving a false authority or credibility to political fads which may be harmful to the Constitution and the American population. That's why the prohibition of establishment of religion is couched also with the free exercise clause in the First Amendment.
You know, I've always posed the question to individuals who seem to think that they could speak on the issue of separation of church and state, and they truly don't understand. See, if there was separation of church and state in their mind, according to their so-called logic, then the House of Representatives would not open every session with an invocation of prayer. They do this because it has been a standing tradition. It's a standing tradition that is rooted, again, in natural law, the Judeo-Christian beliefs. What they don't understand is that, in a nutshell, separation of church and state was the idea that there could be no state-sanctioned religion. It prohibits the government from making any law or establishing a set religion of which the citizens must adhere to. This is why in the First Amendment, the first 5 words are Congress shall make no law. That right there sets the precedent and the tone that the separation of church and state that they don't understand. Almost had an engine failure there, folks, but we corrected it. They don't understand that it's tantamount for people to be able to exercise and practice their own religion, whatever their belief system is. The federal government, the state governments have no authority to intervene and supersede that. So with having that separation there, it allows for the remainder of the First Amendment to take hold and be acted upon as the viable auspice of having the connotations and intents and purposes of the Constitution, which the preamble to the Bill of Rights states as so. It carries the full weight as the Supremacy Clause, seeing that Congress is specifically prohibited from establishing or making any laws that would intervene with religion. Congress shall make no law. They cannot do that. Therefore, the rights of the individuals to practice and exercise their freedom of religion. A lot of people seem to have this notion it's freedom from religion. No. Only atheists would fall into that factor, and I don't even think atheists are true individuals to begin with, because they can't even understand the scope of that. Because when they say, well, I don't believe in God, well, to speak his name is acknowledgement. So atheists are shills and frauds to begin with, in my opinion.
Right. And it's just one of those crucial parts of the development of the United States that has been swept under the rug with revisionist history, especially at institutions of higher education, and that actually proves to be a great segue into the next topic. In another example of the doctrine of political correctness running wild, the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill has circulated a quote-unquote language guide to students, which encourages them to refrain from using words which include man. According to the Blaze, this is now perceived as sexist. As I have stated on numerous separate occasions, the radical left have always engaged in these stupid games of semantics. We've seen it with the corruption or perversion of the word gay. If you look back at literature or popular songs or movies from 50 or 60 years ago and beyond, the word had a singular meaning, mainly that of being happy. Now, however, you never hear the word used in such a context. That's because the radical left has managed to completely uproot the traditional definition and meaning of the word. It's similar to the way in which the word liberal has been corrupted. While it may seem like a non-important issue on the surface, it's important to recall that these changes occur in small steps. If you cut the body politic of the country enough, you will eventually bleed the lifeblood out of it. That's the very goal of these radical left-wing extremists. By eliminating or discouraging the use of words which contain man, these self-proclaimed acolytes of tolerance are actually preaching the doctrine and marching under the banner of intolerance. They're seeking the utter destruction of the proper grammar and syntax of the English language. What's more, it further demonstrates just how destructive they can be. When you can change the meaning of well-established words, you can also change the history of an entire nation. Revisionism, Jeremy has expanded beyond history to include language, science, and any other form of intellectual discussion and understanding. Since when did sensitivity trump common sense? You see, sensitivity has nothing to do with it. They're seeking the complete corruption of every facet and aspect of society as a whole. This is a dangerous attack upon the principles upon which made this country great. But hasn't that always been their goal? Look at any place in the world where the radical left has taken control of government and holds the reins of power. The common denominator that you'll notice in all of these countries is that the political powers that be are hostile to the traditions and values which are championed by that country. The United States is no exception to this rule. Left-wing politicians and pundits salivate at the opportunity to tear down everything that made this country the most powerful and wealthiest country on earth.
Well, since we're on the topic of words and phrases being bastardized, let's look at one that actually speaks volumes to this. Social justice. See, now, social justice, people say, oh, well, we have to have it, social justice. It's not right, it's an infringement on this. And no, social justice is nothing more than the means of taking a doctrine, that doctrine being socialism, and applying the tenets to it in order to subvert justice. Justice under the auspice of our supreme law of the land. They want to be able to cherry pick how rights are applied and how they are to be upheld within the legal system, and they want to interpret them and morph them, and turn them into a chameleon of sense to mean something that is outside the scope and the framework of the spirit of the Constitution. They want to take another political system, a theory, a doctrine, and inject it into our supreme law of the land in order to twist it, to make it more appealing, to play on the emotions of individuals. We have another term that's been thrown around, and it really annoys me when I see individuals candidates, politicians, so on and so forth, especially those that have a working understanding of the Constitution in legal terms, illegal immigration. That is nothing more than an oxymoron. It absolutely is an oxymoron, just as social justice is an oxymoron. You cannot have something like illegal immigration. It cannot exist, because immigration is the legal means and process of which an individual comes to a country in order to gain citizenship. How can you do something that's legal in an illegal fashion? That would be like saying legal rape or legal murder. It can't happen, because the fact of the matter is, rape and murder are both illegal things. You cannot legally do something to somebody that's illegal to begin with. It can't happen. Whereas, vice versa, you cannot illegally do something that is legal. If you are doing something that is legal, there is no illegality about it.
Right. And folks, we've all seen it. Institutions of higher learning throughout the United States have become a bastion and hotbed of radical left-wing ideology and lunacy. It's been that way for quite some time. Unfortunately, it's having a detrimental impact on the population as a whole. A truly functioning Republican form of government requires a well-versed and knowledgeable electorate. Unfortunately, as these ludicrous developments in American universities have shown, our electorate is increasingly becoming uninformed. This is why things like the anchor baby problem have grown rampant in America. It is high past time that the American citizen becomes proactive in his or her political and constitutional interests. Because, as we've already said, only you have the power to stand up and protect your rights. It is your responsibility that you cannot delegate away. We must all be aware of what's happening around us. And to truly achieve this, we must be fluent in the scope, application, and procedure of the United States Constitution. When we grow complacent, the government acts in such a way as to slowly diminish our fundamental, unalienable rights. That's the danger that our founding fathers always attempted to warn us about. The institutions of higher learning are no exception to this. Knowledge holds the key to the living process behind our representative republic. When we fail to correct misinformation, it makes it all the easier for the powers of despotism and tyranny to take hold. They work in a tireless fashion to strip this country of everything that holds value and meaning. And these schools are but one example of the decay of morality within the United States. Along with moral decay comes the departure of common sense. These acolytes of the new left are attempting to tear down the old so that they can replace it with their utopian socialist vision for the world. I use the term utopian socialist for a specific reason. When one recalls that the actual meaning of utopia is that of being no place, all of a sudden it becomes all the more apparent that this socialist agenda will never succeed. When Thomas More wrote Utopia, he was making the point that a perfect place could not exist on Earth. Just as a perfect place cannot exist, socialism cannot properly function because it is a corrupt and malicious system. It ignores the tenets of natural law and therefore, by its very nature, cannot succeed.
Speaking of knowledge, and again, I cannot reiterate this enough, having the knowledge of the Constitution, understanding what your rights are to be applied, how the Constitution is to be followed. That knowledge is power. All knowledge is power. See, the thing is, we the people have the authority. We have the power. It is designed that way by the framers and founders of the Constitution. It is our obligation, our responsibility to delegate that power, specifically to the states and to the federal government. A lot of people bring up this whole thing, and we've talked about this before, states' rights. States don't have rights. They have delegated authorities or delegated powers. Come from whom? The people. When individuals have a lack of knowledge on the Constitution and they vote, when you vote, you are delegating that authority to those elected officials. And when you do so in a malicious way of not having the knowledge of the Constitution, you are giving them the authority to trump you. Because they will not blink an eye at using their elected seat, their power that you've given to them so blindly, to turn the tables on you and turn you into a subject. Rather than being a sovereign individual, you now become a worker for them. It needs to be understood that all elected officials at every single level, local, state, and federal, they work for us. They are our employees. We delegate them the duties and responsibility to follow a set parameter. Not having the knowledge of what that parameter entails, i.e. the Constitution, you are willfully giving away power that is going to be used against you. Knowledge is power. I can't exemplify that enough. I can't reiterate it enough. I can't harp on it enough. So I will do so even if it takes my final breath, so that all individuals, even if I reach one individual, or Randy reaches one individual, together, one person turns into 10. 10 turns into 100. It's exponential. It will grow. So long as that message is perceived and understood in the fashion that it should be. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land. That is what embodies us and empowers us, we the people, to make the decisions, to give the authority for those individuals to govern us, to set laws so that we won't tear each other apart. So we will live in a society to where chaos and anarchy and totalitarianism and tyranny does not take a foothold. That is my only hope. That is what I'm looking to do. That is, if people will say, well, you have an agenda. Yes, I do. I want my country to be that of which the Founding Fathers envisioned. I'm willing to bet that Randy feels the same, as do many of our listeners. In order to act properly and to achieve this, we all have to have the knowledge of the Constitution. I don't know everything about the Constitution. I never will claim to know everything about the Constitution, because I'm always learning more and more about it, because I crave that knowledge, because I understand it is my duty as a United States citizen to have that knowledge in order for me to be able to delegate that authority to someone to govern over me.
And as we have said numerous times on today's show, it is our responsibility to care for ourselves. We cannot delegate that away to anyone else. And that is why we here at the Wright Flyer are so grateful that we have you as a listening audience, because as each and every one of us delves into the Constitution, reading what's contained in the four corners of that sacred document, we gain a better understanding of the Constitution, and we become better individuals ourselves. That is such an important aspect of all of this, and it is why our country has risen to such lofty heights in the past, and I also believe that is why the United States can be great once again. We have to put faith in the natural law system upon which our country is designed, because it is through that system that we were able to create the environment which is conducive to expanding liberty and becoming great, having all of those free aspects which characterize the American spirit, character, and above all, identity. And what you can see from all of the nefarious actors here in America, that are doing whatever they can to push for tyranny and oppression and despotism. They are diametrically and wholly opposed to what makes this country great. Therefore, we must stand against them. And one of the best ways to stand against them, to mount a truly effective front against them, is to spread the knowledge of the United States Constitution, which is the greatest weapon in the arsenal of liberty and freedom. That's why we thank you for flying with us each and every time. We have reached that point in time where it is time for us to begin our descent. I'm sending back the flight attendant for one last round of alcohol. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the descent. I'm Randy Wright, and of course, as always, I was joined by my first officer, Jeremy Grapington. We appreciate you for coming on board. Sit back, relax, as we bring it home.